Hello, my friend, and welcome. Tonight, we travel back to the 13th century, to a Europe of cathedrals and castles, of pilgrims and plagues, of kings who believed their crowns were given to them not merely by blood, but by God. We travel to the court of France, to the bedside of a young king burning with fever, and to a vow whispered between life and death that would send tens of thousands of men across the sea to die in the mud of the Nile Delta. This is the story of the Seventh Crusade. This is the story of Louis IX of France, a king the world would one day call a saint, and the catastrophe he led into Egypt in the name of Christ. To understand why a king of France would gather an army, mortgage his kingdom, and sail to a foreign land halfway across the world, we must first understand the man himself and the world that shaped him. Louis was born in 1214 in the reign of his grandfather Philip Augustus into a France that was still assembling itself out of feuding duchies and rival counts. His father, Louis VIII, died young in 1226 when Louis was only 12 years old. That left the throne and the kingdom in the hands of a boy king and his mother, Blanche of Castile, a formidable Spanish princess who had married into the French royal house and who now, as regent, had to hold together a realm surrounded by ambitious nobles eager to test the strength of a child. Blanche of Castile is one of the great unsung figures of medieval Europe. She crushed rebellions, negotiated with barons twice her age and far more experienced in the game of power, and raised her son not simply to be a king, but to be a specific kind of king, pious to the point of asceticism, just to the point of severity, and utterly convinced that his authority flowed directly from heaven. She is said to have told him that she would rather see him dead than see him commit a mortal sin. Whether or not the story is exactly true, it captures the spirit of the household in which Louis grew up. Prayer, fasting, confession, and the reading of scripture were not occasional devotions for him. They were the architecture of his daily life, as regular as meals, and in later years arguably more important to him than meals themselves. By the time Louis reached adulthood, he had already proven himself a capable and, at times, ruthless ruler. He fought off rebellious barons, negotiated a lasting peace with England through the Treaty of Paris, and built royal authority in France to a level his predecessors could only have dreamed of. He married Margaret of Provence in 1234, and by all contemporary accounts, theirs was a marriage of real affection, complicated as it was by the ever-watchful presence of his mother, who reportedly disapproved of how much time the young couple spent together, and did what she could to keep them apart. Despite that friction, Louis and Margaret would have 11 children together, several of whom would later share in the ordeal that awaited the family in Egypt. Louis ruled a kingdom that, on the surface, appeared prosperous and secure. French agriculture was expanding. Paris was becoming one of the great intellectual centers of Christendom, its university drawing scholars from across Europe. The Gothic cathedrals rising across the French countryside, Chartres, Amiens, and soon Louis's own beloved Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, stood as monuments to a civilization confident in its faith and its future. And yet beneath that confidence ran a current of anxiety that never fully went away: the fate of the Holy Land. For 150 years, since Pope Urban II had called the First Crusade in 1095, European Christians had fought, bled, and died over the question of who would control Jerusalem and the sites associated with the life of Christ. The First Crusade had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, capturing Jerusalem in 1099 and establishing a patchwork of Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa. But those gains had proven fragile. Edessa fell in 1144, prompting the disastrous Second Crusade. And in 1187, the great Muslim leader Saladin crushed the armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at the Horns of Hattin and recaptured Jerusalem itself, ending 88 years of Christian rule over the city. The Third Crusade, led in part by Richard the Lionheart of England, recovered some coastal territory but never retook Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, notoriously, never even reached the Holy Land at all, diverting instead to sack Constantinople, a fellow Christian city, in 1204, an act that would poison relations between the Latin West and the Byzantine East for generations. By the 1240s, the Crusader states clung to a narrow strip of the Levanten coast, Acre, Tyre, Sidon, Jaffa, dependent on periodic infusions of soldiers, money, and morale from Europe, and increasingly squeezed by the rising power of Muslim states in Egypt and Syria. It was into this long, painful history that Louis inserted himself, and the circumstances of his decision to take the cross were as personal as they were political. In December of 1244, Louis fell gravely ill. Contemporary chroniclers describe a fever so severe that at one point he was believed to be dead, and preparations were reportedly made to cover his body with a shroud. Then, unexpectedly, he stirred. According to the account of Jean de Joinville, the nobleman and chronicler who would become Louis's closest companion on Crusade and the single richest source we have for these events, Louis's first words upon regaining consciousness were a vow. He would take the cross. He would go to the aid of the Holy Land. This was not a casual promise made lightly and forgotten upon recovery, as his mother and advisors perhaps hoped it might be. Louis meant it absolutely. When he had recovered enough to speak clearly, and his mother and the Bishop of Paris urged him to reconsider, arguing that the vow had been made in a state of delirium and was therefore not binding, Louis reportedly tore the cross symbol from his own clothing and asked for it to be sewn back on, declaring that he would not eat again until he had received the cross a second time, this time in full possession of his senses. It was, in other words, a decision he insisted on making twice, once in fever and once in clarity, so that no one could say it had been made by accident. Why did the news of a French king's vow matter so much beyond the borders of France itself? Because by 1244, the situation in the Holy Land had once again become desperate, and news of a fresh catastrophe was reaching Europe just as Louis lay in his sickbed. Earlier that same year, a group of Khwarezmian Turks, refugees themselves from the Mongol conquests further east, had been employed as mercenaries by the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt and unleashed on Jerusalem. The city, held by Christians under a fragile treaty arrangement, was sacked with terrible brutality. Then, in October of 1244, at the Battle of La Fourby near Gaza, the combined armies of the Crusader states and their local Muslim allies were annihilated by Egyptian and Khwarezmian forces. It was one of the worst military disasters the Crusader states had ever suffered, arguably worse in its consequences than Hattin itself, because it destroyed the field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem almost entirely. When word of La Fourby reached Europe in the following months, it created a sense of emergency. This was the news, arriving in the same window of time as Louis's illness and recovery, that gave his private vow a public and urgent meaning. Louis's decision, however, was not universally welcomed at home. His mother Blanche, who had steered the kingdom through his minority and still exercised enormous influence, was reportedly devastated, viewing the crusade as an almost suicidal risk for the King of France to take personally, given that kings had traditionally sent armies and money rather than leading expeditions themselves, at least not since Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus had gone on the Third Crusade more than 50 years earlier. Many of his barons were equally unenthusiastic. The cost, the danger, and the long absence of the king from his own kingdom all weighed against the idea. Pope Innocent IV, for his part, welcomed the crusade in principle, but was consumed at the time with his own bitter political war against the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a conflict that would drain resources and attention away from the crusading effort in ways that would matter later. But Louis was not a man easily deterred once he had settled his conscience on a course of action. For the next 3.5 years, from his vow in December 1244 to his eventual departure in the summer of 1248, He devoted the administrative machinery of the French crown to an unprecedented feat of logistics, the raising of money, men, ships, and supplies on a scale France had never before attempted for an overseas expedition. It is this preparation, this remarkable mobilization of a medieval kingdom for war on a foreign continent, that we will turn to in our next chapter. Chapter 2: Building an army to cross the sea. A crusade did not simply happen because a king wished it. It had to be built, piece by piece, over years, out of money, timber, grain, horses, and the fragile, complicated loyalty of thousands of men who had to be persuaded, bribed, or obligated into leaving their homes for a war on the other side of the known world. Louis IX spent 3.5 years on this task, and the effort he poured into it reveals a great deal about both the man and the medieval state he commanded. Money came first, because money was the precondition for everything else. Louis imposed a tax on the church in France, with the cooperation of Pope Innocent IV, amounting to a substantial portion of ecclesiastical income collected over several years specifically to fund the Crusade. He also levied contributions from towns and from the royal domain itself. Contemporary estimates, imprecise as medieval financial records often are, suggest that Louis spent an amount equivalent to roughly 6 times the annual revenue of the French crown on the Crusade, an almost unimaginable sum that reveals both the seriousness of his commitment and the scale of debt and taxation that the kingdom would absorb in the name of this holy war. Beyond money, there was the matter of a port. France's Mediterranean coastline in the 13th century was limited and poorly developed for large-scale military embarkation. Louis solved this by essentially building a harbor town from nothing, Aigues-Mortes, on the marshy Mediterranean coast of Languedoc. Before Louis's crusade, Aigues-Mortes was little more than a modest settlement amid salt marshes. Louis invested heavily in constructing a proper port there, along with the beginnings of the fortifications that would later become the famous walled town tourists visit today. It gave France, for the first time, a royal Mediterranean port under direct crown control, rather than depending on the goodwill and shipping capacity of Italian maritime republics like Genoa, Venice, or Marseille, cities with their own competing interests. And in the case of Venice, a rather notorious recent history of diverting crusading armies toward its own commercial and political goals during the Fourth Crusade. Louis nonetheless still needed those Italian maritime powers for the ships themselves, and he negotiated contracts with Genoa and Marseille for transport vessels, since France's own shipbuilding capacity could not come close to meeting the demand of transporting an army of thousands of knights, sergeants, crossbowmen, horses, and the mountains of equipment and provisions a medieval army required for an extended overseas campaign. Modern historians estimate the crusading force that eventually assembled numbered somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 people in total, including combatants, along with several thousand horses, a logistical undertaking of a scale that dwarfed almost anything else attempted in medieval Europe up to that point. Louis also worked to secure his kingdom in his absence. He knew that leaving France for years, possibly forever if he died on campaign as so many crusaders before him had, required stable governance at home. He appointed his mother, Blanche of Castile, once again as regent, trusting her proven administrative skill and her fierce protectiveness of the Capetian dynasty to hold the kingdom together. This was a decision that would matter enormously later, when catastrophe struck in Egypt and desperate letters had to travel back and forth across the Mediterranean and overland, through months of uncertainty about whether the king was alive, captured, or dead. The king also worked to bring his nobility along with him, both literally and politically. His brothers took the cross alongside him, Robert of Artois, impulsive and hot-tempered, whose recklessness would later prove catastrophic on the battlefield. Charles of Anjou, ambitious and calculating, who would go on to carve out his own kingdom in Sicily years later, and Alphonse of Poitiers, who would join a bit later in the campaign. Many of the great noble houses of France sent their lords. The Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Flanders family, and numerous others, drawn by a complicated mixture of genuine piety, a sense of feudal and chivalric obligation, the hope of glory and plunder, and in some cases, straightforward pressure from a king whose political and financial leverage over his vassals had grown considerably during his reign. Jean de Joinville, the Seneschal of Champagne, deserves special mention here, because it is through his eyes, recorded decades later in his famous chronicle The Life of Saint Louis, that we have our most vivid and human account of this crusade. Joinville was a minor nobleman, not part of the highest tier of the French aristocracy, but he became close to Louis during the campaign, close enough to argue with him, to be trusted with sensitive tasks, and eventually to write the memoir that remains one of the great personal narratives of medieval history. Joinville was honest about his own motivations and fears in a way that few medieval writers were. He tells us plainly that he was reluctant to leave his lands and his people, that he worried about money, and that the decision to go on crusade was for him as much a matter of feudal obligation and personal reputation as of pure religious zeal. This honesty is part of why his account has remained so valuable and so readable across the centuries. It gives us a crusade populated by real, flawed, frightened, and sometimes very funny human beings, rather than the flattened saints and villains of more formal ecclesiastical chronicles. Louis also attended to matters of diplomacy before departing. He sent envoys to the Mongols, whose westward conquests had shattered kingdoms from China to the doorstep of Europe, and who were, at this point, still something of a mystery to Western Christendom. Rumors had circulated for decades of a legendary Christian king in the East, Prester John, and some in Europe hoped, naively as it turned out, that the Mongols might be that legendary ally, or at least could be persuaded to join forces against the Muslim powers of the Middle East. Louis's mission to the Mongols would ultimately produce nothing but a demand, delivered by the Great Khan's court, that Louis submit to Mongol authority and pay tribute, a demand Louis simply ignored. It was an early sign of how difficult and how poorly understood the geopolitics of the wider world remained to European crusaders, who often projected their own hopes and categories onto powers and peoples they barely comprehended. By the spring of 1248, the pieces were largely in place. Louis received the oriflamme, the sacred red banner of French kings carried into holy war at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, along with a pilgrim's staff and scrip in a solemn ceremony that marked his formal departure as a crusader. He said farewell to his mother, who was said to have wept bitterly, aware that she might never see her son again. On the 12th of June, 1248, Louis left Paris. By late August, he and his forces had gathered at the new port of Aigues-Mortes, and on the 25th of August, 1248, the fleet set sail into the Mediterranean. Their first stop was not the Holy Land or Egypt directly, but the island of Cyprus, ruled at the time by the Lusignan dynasty, itself a remnant of Crusader conquest from the Third Crusade nearly 60 years earlier. Cyprus offered a strategically located, friendly base from which to organize the final push toward Egypt, and it was here, over the winter of 1248 into 1249, that Louis would make the decisions that determined where his crusade would actually strike, and where, in the chapters to come, both his greatest early triumph and his ultimate catastrophe would unfold. Chapter 3: Winter in Cyprus and the Strategy of Egypt. Why Egypt? This is a question worth pausing on, because to modern readers accustomed to thinking of the Crusades as campaigns aimed at Jerusalem, it can seem strange that Louis's great crusading army, having sailed from France with the recovery of the Holy Land as its explicit purpose, would instead direct itself toward the Nile Delta, hundreds of miles from Jerusalem itself. The logic, however, was neither new nor foolish. It had been developing among crusading strategists for decades. Egypt, under the Ayyubid dynasty founded by the descendants and successors of the great Saladin, had become the economic and military powerhouse of the Muslim Near East. Its wealth from trade, particularly the lucrative trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and onward to India, funded large and effective armies. Jerusalem and the other holy sites, meanwhile, were essentially hostages to whoever controlled Egypt and Damascus, the two great population and resource centers of the region. The Fifth Crusade, a generation earlier in 1217 to 1221, had already tried this exact strategy, landing at the Egyptian port city of Damietta, capturing it after a grueling siege, and then attempting to push toward Cairo, only to be trapped by rising Nile floodwaters and forced into a humiliating surrender that gave back everything they had won. Louis and his advisors studied this precedent carefully. They believed, not unreasonably, that the earlier crusade had failed due to poor timing, indecision after the capture of Damietta, and a fatal delay that allowed the Nile flood season to trap the army. Louis intended to do what the Fifth Crusade had attempted, but to do it faster, with more resolve and with better timing. The reasoning was sound in the abstract. Strike at the source of Muslim power in the region, seize a wealthy and strategic territory that could then be used as leverage, perhaps traded back to the Muslim rulers of Syria and the Levant in exchange for Jerusalem itself, a diplomatic maneuver that had precedent, since the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II had actually negotiated Jerusalem's return to Christian control peacefully back in 1229 through treaty rather than conquest. If Egypt could be conquered, or even just seriously threatened, the logic went, the rulers of the region might negotiate away Jerusalem to save their more valuable territory. It was a strategy built on a genuine, if flawed, understanding of regional politics, not a random detour. Cyprus, in the meantime, served its purpose as a staging ground, but it also revealed the strains that would recur throughout the campaign. The Crusaders spent nearly 9 months on the island, far longer than planned, in part because contingents from other parts of Europe, needed to bring the army up to full strength, were delayed in arriving. Disease took a toll during this long wait. The chronicles describe significant losses among both men and horses during the Cyprus sojourn, a grim preview of how logistics and disease, not just battle, would be the great killers of this campaign. Supplies had to be gathered and stored, an effort so extensive that Joinville describes enormous mounds of wine barrels and grain stacked like small hills across the Cypriot countryside, provisions that would sustain the army during the Egyptian campaign to come. It was also during this period that Louis dealt with the complicated politics of alliance and rivalry that always accompanied crusading armies drawn from different feudal territories with their own leaders, their own agendas, and their own long histories of rivalry with one another. The Latin Christian world sending men on this crusade was not a unified nation, but a patchwork of vassals and allies whose cooperation depended heavily on Louis's personal authority, his money, and his ability to manage competing egos, chief among them his own brother Robert of Artois, whose combination of high birth, courage, and reckless impatience would prove decisive and disastrous when the army finally reached the Egyptian mainland. By the spring of 1249, with reinforcements arrived and the worst of the waiting behind them, Louis moved his fleet from Cyprus toward Egypt. The chroniclers describe an extraordinary sight. Hundreds of ships, by some accounts as many as 1,800 vessels including transports and support ships, though such medieval numbers should always be treated with some caution, filling the horizon as they approached the Egyptian coast near Damietta in late May of 1249. What awaited them on that shore, and the battle that would unfold in the surf itself before a single formal siege line had even been drawn, is where we turn next. Chapter 4. The Landing at Damietta. On the 4th of June, 1249, the Crusader fleet arrived off the coast of Damietta, a fortified port city near one of the branches of the Nile as it fans out into the Mediterranean Sea. Damietta was not chosen at random. It had been the target, and briefly the prize of the Fifth Crusade a generation earlier, and it commanded one of the key routes by which an invading army could establish a foothold in Egypt and threaten the interior, including Cairo itself, further up the Nile. The Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt at this time was Al-Salih Ayyub, a capable ruler who had spent years consolidating his own authority within a fractious Ayyubid confederation that had, since the death of Saladin decades earlier, splintered into competing branches controlling Egypt, Damascus, and other regional centers. Al-Salih Ayyub had built a formidable military establishment, notably relying heavily on Mamluks, soldiers of slave origin, often Turkic in ethnic background, trained from a young age in the arts of war, and organized into elite regiments personally loyal to the Sultan who had purchased and raised them. This Mamluk institution, still a support structure for Ayyubid rule at the time of Louis's invasion, would within just over a decade become the ruling power in Egypt in its own right. And it is one of the great ironies of this crusade that the very campaign meant to strike a blow against Muslim power in the region would end up accelerating a political transformation that ultimately produced a Mamluk sultanate far more militarily formidable and far more implacably opposed to any renewed crusading efforts than the Ayyubids had been. When the Crusader fleet appeared off Damietta, Egyptian forces under a local commander gathered on the beach to oppose the landing. What followed, as described by Joinville, who was present, was a dramatic and chaotic amphibious assault, medieval warfare's version of a beach landing, with knights and soldiers wading and rowing ashore under fire from Egyptian troops arrayed to meet them. Louis himself, against the urging of his advisors who wanted him to wait for a more orderly and cautious approach, insisted on going ashore with the first wave. Joinville describes the king, fully armored, leaping from his ship into the water and wading toward the beach with shield raised and lance in hand, rather than waiting safely offshore while others bore the initial risk, a detail that speaks to both Louis's personal courage and his understanding of the symbolic importance of leading from the front in a campaign that was, after all, meant to embody Christian knightly virtue. The landing succeeded. Whether due to the sheer scale and aggression of the Crusader assault, or because of internal disunity and poor leadership on the Egyptian side, the defending forces broke and withdrew. And remarkably, the defenders of Damietta itself, perhaps remembering the brutal and lengthy siege the city endured during the Fifth Crusade a generation before, and perhaps receiving word of the death of local commanders during the beach fighting, evacuated the city almost entirely rather than face another such ordeal. When Crusader forces entered Damietta in the days following the landing, they found the city essentially abandoned by its garrison and much of its population, an extraordinary and unexpected windfall that gave Louis, within days of arriving in Egypt, control of one of the most important fortified ports in the entire country, without the months-long siege that had cost the Fifth Crusade so dearly in time, resources, and lives. This rapid, almost bloodless capture of Damietta should have been the springboard for a swift and decisive campaign. Instead, as we will see in the chapters ahead, it became the beginning of a long, fatal delay, born of both practical necessity and very human indecision, that would cost the Crusaders the advantage of momentum and surprise, and would give the Egyptians, under new and increasingly capable leadership, the time they needed to regroup, reorganize, and prepare the trap that awaited the Crusaders further up the Nile, at a town called Mansoura. We will continue this documentary in the chapters ahead. The fateful delay at Damietta, the death of Sultan Al-Salih Ayyub in the middle of the campaign, the march inland, the battle for Mansoura, and the unraveling of the entire crusade into one of the great military disasters of the age. For now, we pause here, at the high water mark of Crusader fortune in Egypt, before the tide begins irreversibly to turn. Chapter 5. The fateful delay and the death of a sultan. Victory at Damietta should have been the opening move of a swift campaign. Instead, it became the first of several delays that, in hindsight, cost Louis the initiative he had won so cheaply on the beach. Several factors converged to keep the Crusaders in Damietta for months rather than days. The first was practical. The Nile's annual flood cycle governed everything about military movement in Egypt, just as it had doomed the Fifth Crusade a generation earlier. The river rose dramatically each summer, from roughly June through September or October, turning the delta into a landscape of temporary lakes, swollen canals, and impassable mud. Any army marching south from Damietta toward Cairo during this period risked being trapped, encircled, or simply swallowed by rising water, exactly the fate that had crushed the earlier expedition. Louis and his commanders knew this history well, and it argued strongly for waiting until the floodwaters receded before pushing inland. The second factor was reinforcement. Louis's brother, Alphonse of Poitiers, had not yet arrived from France with a substantial body of additional troops, and Louis was reluctant to commit to the next, far more dangerous phase of the campaign without the full strength of the army he had spent years assembling. Waiting for Alphonse meant waiting through the very heart of the flood season, compounding the delay considerably. The third factor was the strange, procedural, and very medieval question of what to do with Damietta itself, and who would govern it, and how the spoils of its capture should be divided. Under the customs that governed crusading expeditions, the king of Jerusalem, or whoever held a legitimate claim to represent the kingdom of Jerusalem, traditionally received a portion of any conquered territory. The papal legate accompanying the crusade, a cardinal named Odo of Chateauroux, also had to be consulted on matters of ecclesiastical authority in the newly captured city, since a mosque had to be reconsecrated as a cathedral and a Latin bishopric established. These arrangements, along with the practical work of garrisoning the city, distributing captured goods, and establishing a functioning market and supply base, consumed weeks of administrative effort that, again, ate into the narrow window during which an inland campaign could realistically be launched. Meanwhile, the delay was not cost-free for Crusader morale or discipline. Joinville and other chroniclers describe a familiar and unflattering pattern that had plagued crusading armies before, with a captured city full of goods, wine, and captive or fled inhabitants, abandoned property, discipline among the rank and file frayed. Gambling, drinking, and disorder became problems serious enough that Louis felt compelled to issue strict ordinances regulating the conduct of his own men, including measures against gambling and prostitution within the camp, an attempt to keep his crusade morally as well as militarily disciplined, in keeping with his own personal piety. While the Crusaders waited, remarkable events were unfolding on the other side of the lines. Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, already suffering from tuberculosis and in declining health when the crusade arrived, had rushed to the front near Mansoura, the town that commanded the point where a canal, the Bahr al-Saghir, met the main branch of the Nile between Damietta and Cairo, a natural defensive choke point the Egyptians fortified heavily to bar the Crusaders' path south. The Sultan, gravely ill, directed the defense of his kingdom from what was essentially a sickbed, a grim mirror of Louis's own near-death experience that had launched this crusade in the first place. In late November of 1249, Sultan al-Salih Ayyub died at his camp near Mansoura. His death could easily have thrown the Egyptian defense into chaos at a critical moment, opening a real opportunity for the Crusaders had they known and acted quickly. Instead, in one of the most consequential acts of concealment in medieval military history, the Sultan's inner circle, led by his remarkable and formidable wife, Shajar al-Durr, a former slave who had risen to become one of the most powerful women in the medieval Islamic world, kept the Sultan's death secret. Reportedly, meals continued to be sent to his tent as though he still lived. Official documents continued to be issued under his seal, and messengers continued to be dispatched with alleged orders from the Sultan, all while Shajar al-Durr and a small circle of loyal commanders, including the eunuch Jamal al-Din Musin and key Mamluk officers, secretly summoned the Sultan's son and heir, Turanshah, who was far away in Syria. To return and take command before word of his father's death could spread and destabilize the defense. This extraordinary act of political theater bought the Egyptians the time they needed. The defense at Mansoura held firm, reinforced and reorganized under the effective, if unofficial, leadership of experienced Mamluk commanders operating in the Sultan's name, even though the Sultan himself lay dead. It was a demonstration of remarkable discipline and unity of purpose on the Egyptian side, in stark contrast to the divisions of command and impulsive decision-making that would soon plague the Crusader camp. By the time Louis finally began his advance south from Damietta in late November and early December of 1249, time to take advantage of the receding floodwaters, he was marching toward an enemy whose true leadership crisis was invisible to him, hidden behind a dead sultan's tent flaps, while his own crusade was about to be undone by leadership problems of a very different and very visible kind. Chapter 6. The March upriver and the crossing at Mansoura. The Crusader army that set out from Damietta in late 1249, moving south along the eastern bank of the Nile toward Cairo, was an impressive and cumbersome thing. Thousands of mounted knights in full mail and plate, foot soldiers, crossbowmen, engineers, chaplains, servants, and an enormous baggage train of supplies, all moving at the pace of the slowest ox cart, shadowed the entire way by the Nile itself, which Louis used as a supply line, with boats ferrying provisions alongside the marching column. Progress was slow and cautious, punctuated by skirmishes with Egyptian light cavalry harassing the column's flanks, probing for weaknesses without committing to a full engagement. By December, the army reached the vicinity of Mansoura, a fortified town the Egyptians had turned into their main defensive position, protected on one side by the Nile itself, and on another by the Bahr al-Saghir, a canal that ran between the Crusader approach and the town, forming a formidable water barrier that stalled the Crusader advance for weeks. The two armies effectively faced each other across this canal through the closing weeks of 1249 and into early 1250, exchanging missile fire, mounting occasional skirmishes, and enduring what by all accounts was a miserable, muddy, disease-ridden encampment on the Crusader side, while engineers attempted various schemes to bridge or dam the waterway so the army could force a crossing. Louis's engineers built a causeway, essentially attempting to fill in a portion of the canal to create a land bridge that the army could cross under fire, an ambitious and labor-intensive project harassed constantly by Egyptian counterfire, including, according to some chronicle accounts, an early and terrifying use of what the sources call Greek fire, a fearsome incendiary weapon that the Egyptian defenders launched at the Crusader siege works and bridging equipment. Burning through the wooden structures the Crusaders had painstakingly built. Joinville, who witnessed these bombardments personally while assigned to help defend the siege engines, gives one of the most vivid eyewitness descriptions in all of medieval literature of what it was like to endure this kind of bombardment, describing the terrifying visual spectacle of the burning projectiles arcing through the night sky like great fiery dragons, trailing sparks, and the sheer psychological terror they inspired even among battle-hardened knights, who reportedly fell to their knees in prayer every time the weapon was launched toward their position. Weeks of this frustrating, costly siege warfare produced little progress on the causeway, as the Egyptians simply dug out on their own side of the canal whatever the Crusaders filled in on theirs, an infuriating stalemate. The breakthrough, when it finally came in early February of 1250, arrived not through engineering but through local knowledge and betrayal, or perhaps simple opportunism. A local Bedouin guide, according to Joinville's account, revealed to the Crusaders the location of a ford across the canal, a crossing point some distance from the main defensive line, where the army could cross the water without needing to complete the stalled causeway project. In exchange for payment, This guide agreed to lead a Crusader force to the crossing. On the morning of the 8th of February, 1250, the vanguard of the Crusader army, including the Knights Templar and the mounted knights commanded by Robert of Artois, the king's own brother, crossed the ford under cover of surprise, catching an Egyptian advance guard encamped nearby completely unprepared. What followed in the confused early morning fighting was, by every account, both the most spectacular tactical success and the single most catastrophic strategic blunder of the entire crusade, born in the same impulsive decision made in a matter of minutes on that riverbank at dawn. Chapter 7: Robert of Artois and the Charge into Mansoura. The initial crossing achieved a genuine surprise. The Egyptian encampment nearest the ford, apparently including a portion of the Mamluk regiments, and by some accounts, caught the Egyptian commander Fakhr al-Din, one of the most senior military leaders left directing the defense after the Sultan's concealed death, entirely off guard. Fakhr al-Din, according to the chronicles, was killed in the initial onslaught, reportedly while still in his bath or freshly roused from sleep, a detail repeated across multiple sources that, whether precisely accurate or not, conveys just how total and sudden the initial Crusader surprise was. The Egyptian forward camp was routed in short order. At this point, the plan, insofar as one existed, called for the vanguard to secure the crossing, hold their position, and wait for Louis and the main body of the army to cross the ford and consolidate before advancing further. This was the sound, disciplined course of action, and it is precisely the course that the Templars and the more experienced commanders in the vanguard argued for once the initial rout of the Egyptian camp had been achieved. Robert of Artois disagreed, violently and fatally. Flush with the shock of an easy initial victory, and by the account of Joinville and others driven by a combination of genuine battlefield excitement, a competitive rivalry with the Templars over who would claim the greater glory, and simple reckless impatience, Robert insisted on pressing the advantage immediately, pursuing the fleeing Egyptian survivors directly into the fortified town of Mansoura itself, rather than waiting for the king and the rest of the army to cross and support the advance. When the Templar commanders objected, warning that charging into an unfamiliar, narrow, fortified town with an unsupported vanguard was exactly the kind of reckless overreach that had doomed crusading forces before, Robert reportedly accused them of cowardice and jealousy, needling them for hesitating to fight while glory was there for the taking, and declared he would take the town himself if they lacked the courage to follow. Whatever mixture of honor, pride, and peer pressure moved them, the Templars and the rest of the vanguard followed Robert of Artois' charge into the streets of Mansoura. It proved to be a trap of the deadliest kind, though an accidental one born of Egyptian resilience rather than deliberate design. Mansoura's streets were narrow, unfamiliar to the Crusaders, and the town's defenders, along with Mamluk forces that had not been caught in the initial rout, including elite units under commanders who would go on to shape Egypt's future, most notably a Mamluk officer named Baybars, regrouped with remarkable speed once the initial shock of the surprise attack passed. Crusader knights on their large war horses found themselves trapped in tight urban lanes, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat in good order, picked off from rooftops and alleys, and gradually surrounded and cut down in a chaotic, close-quarters massacre very different from the open-field cavalry battles that European knights were trained and equipped to fight. Robert of Artois himself was killed in the fighting inside Mansoura, along with the vast majority of the Templar knights present, and a great many other prominent French nobles who had followed the charge. It was, in a single reckless hour, one of the most devastating losses of experienced knightly manpower the Crusade would suffer, wiping out virtually the entire vanguard, the very force that just hours earlier had achieved the Crusade's most dazzling tactical success. When news of Robert's death and the destruction of the vanguard reached Louis, who was at that time still working to get the main body of the army across the ford under continuing resistance, it landed as a devastating blow, both personally, as the loss of his own brother, and strategically, as the loss of a substantial portion of his best fighting force on what was intended to be only the opening phase of the day's operations. The fighting was far from over, however, and Louis himself, along with the portion of the army that had by now crossed the canal, still had to face the reorganized Egyptian and Mamluk forces in the open ground outside Mansura's walls. That confrontation, and the desperate, day-long battle that followed, tested Louis's own courage and generalship directly, and it is to that battle, along with its brutal aftermath in the weeks that followed, that we turn next. Chapter 8: The King and the Field. While Robert of Artois and the vanguard were being annihilated inside Mansura, King Louis himself was leading the main body of the army across the ford under continuing pressure. Once across, Louis found himself facing organized and increasingly effective Egyptian and Mamluk counterattacks in the open ground between the canal and the town, a very different kind of fighting than the chaotic street battle that had just destroyed his vanguard, but no less dangerous. Here, in the open field, the discipline and equipment of European heavy cavalry could be used to better effect than in the cramped alleys of Mansura, and Louis distinguished himself personally through the day's fighting in a manner that even hostile or skeptical chroniclers would later acknowledge. Joinville, who fought near the king through much of this engagement, describes Louis in the thick of hand-to-hand combat, his own household knights forming a protective ring around him as wave after wave of Mamluk cavalry pressed the Crusader line, probing for weaknesses, attempting envelopment, and unleashing showers of arrows into the packed ranks of European men-at-arms who had none of the mobility advantages that had made Mamluk horse archers so formidable against slower-moving armies for generations. The fighting on the 8th of February, 1250, stretched across the entire day, an exhausting, bloody struggle of repeated charges and countercharges, with the Crusaders gradually consolidating a defensive position anchored on the captured Egyptian camp near the ford, using tents, wagons, and whatever field fortifications could be improvised under fire as a base from which to resist the Mamluk attacks. By evening, the Crusaders held the field, in the narrow tactical sense that they had not been driven back across the canal and had inflicted serious losses on the attacking Egyptian and Mamluk forces, including, by some accounts, a substantial portion of the elite Mamluk regiments engaged that day. But it was a victory purchased at a cost that made it feel, almost immediately, like a defeat. The vanguard destroyed, Robert of Artois dead along with most of the senior Templar leadership, and an army now dangerously exposed, deep in hostile territory. Its supply lines stretched back along the Nile to Damietta, facing an enemy that, contrary to Crusader hopes after the Sultan's death, showed no sign of collapsing into disunity or panic. In the days that followed the battle, the two armies settled into an uneasy standoff around Mansura, both sides too exhausted and too battered to force an immediate decision, but neither willing to withdraw. The Crusaders held a fortified camp. The Egyptians and Mamluks, now under the effective field leadership of commanders including Baybars, who had distinguished himself in the fighting at Mansura, and whose reputation would only grow in the years ahead, harassed the Crusader position continuously, cutting off foraging parties, contesting the river approaches, and gradually strangling the flow of supplies that Louis's army depended upon. Then, in the final days of February 1250, Turanshah, the son of the dead Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, finally arrived from Syria to formally take command of the Egyptian war effort, the succession that Shajar al-Dur and her allies had worked for months to protect through their elaborate concealment of the old sultan's death. Turanshah brought fresh troops, renewed strategic direction, and crucially, a plan to cut the Crusaders off entirely from their line of supply and retreat along the Nile. Egyptian forces began transporting light boats overland to a point on the Nile south of the Crusader position, launching them into the river behind Louis's army, and using this force to seize or destroy Crusader supply vessels attempting to move between the Mansura camp and Damietta. Within a short time, this maneuver achieved a devastating strategic effect. The Crusader army at Mansura, already reduced in strength and exhausted from weeks of hard fighting, found itself effectively surrounded and cut off from resupply, its horses starving, its men reduced to eating the animals that remained. And disease, always the silent killer of medieval armies, beginning to spread rapidly through the crowded, unsanitary camp. What followed was one of the grimmest chapters of the entire crusade. Not a single dramatic battle, but a slow, grinding collapse brought on by starvation, dysentery, and a disease the chroniclers describe in terms consistent with scurvy or a related nutritional deficiency, which caused men's gums to blacken and rot, their skin to develop dark blotches, and a slow, wasting death that claimed soldiers by the hundreds even as they held their defensive positions against continued Egyptian pressure. Joinville himself fell seriously ill during this period, and his chronicle includes harrowing personal descriptions of barbers cutting away dead flesh from the gums of afflicted soldiers, a horrifying, matter-of-fact detail of medieval military medicine that captures just how far the crusade had descended from the triumphant landing at Damietta only months before. By early April of 1250, Louis, himself now seriously ill with the same dysentery afflicting his army, recognized that the position at Mansura was no longer tenable. On the 5th of April, 1250, he ordered a retreat back toward Damietta, a withdrawal made under the worst possible conditions. A starving, disease-ravaged army harassed the entire way by pursuing Egyptian and Mamluk forces, attempting to move along the Nile while also trying to protect its sick and wounded, including the king himself, who was reportedly so weakened by illness that he had to be carried for portions of the retreat, refusing, even in this condition, to abandon his men or flee ahead of them by boat, a decision his advisors begged him to reconsider for his own safety, and one that, whatever its wisdom in purely strategic terms, sealed his personal fate as the retreat collapsed into chaos. Chapter 9. Capture at Faraskar. The retreat from Mansura toward Damietta in early April of 1250 rapidly disintegrated from an organized, if desperate, withdrawal into a rout. The Crusader army, weakened by months of disease and starvation, harried continuously by pursuing Mamluk cavalry and Egyptian forces who sensed, correctly, that total victory was now within reach, began to fall apart as a coherent fighting force almost as soon as it left its fortified camp near Mansura. Louis himself, gravely ill with dysentery to the point that, according to Joinville's unflinching account, he had to have the seat of his garments cut away because he was too weak and too afflicted to manage his own basic bodily functions while remaining mounted, nonetheless refused repeated urgings from his own commanders to abandon the army and escape by boat down the Nile to the safety of Damietta. This refusal, whatever mixture of genuine loyalty to his suffering men and simple physical incapacity to travel any faster lay behind it, meant that the king moved at the desperate, faltering pace of his most exhausted and dying soldiers, rather than the pace that might have preserved his own freedom. Near the town of Faraskar, not far from Mansura and still a considerable distance from the safety of Damietta, the retreating Crusader column was finally overtaken and surrounded by Egyptian and Mamluk forces. What remained of organized resistance collapsed. Thousands of Crusaders were killed in the final stages of this pursuit, and thousands more, including, most consequentially, King Louis IX of France himself, were taken captive. Louis was found, according to the accounts that survive, in a small house near Faraskar, having been separated from his bodyguard in the confusion and disintegration of the retreat, and was taken prisoner not by chance recognition of his royal identity in the initial chaos, but through negotiation once it became clear who had been captured. An Egyptian commander reportedly securing the king's surrender with an offer of protection rather than immediate execution. The capture of a reigning king of France, the leader of the entire crusading expedition, was an almost unprecedented event in the history of the Crusades up to that point, and it placed both the fate of the remaining Crusader army and the future of the entire expedition into an entirely new and precarious phase. One that would be decided not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table, in the tents and palaces of Turantia's court, over the weeks that followed. It is to that captivity, and to the extraordinary events that would soon overtake Louis's captors themselves, that we turn in the chapters ahead. Chapter 10: A King in Chains. Louis's captivity began in circumstances that could easily have ended in his immediate death. Medieval warfare offered no guarantee of merciful treatment for a defeated enemy, even a royal one, and the Mamluk and Egyptian forces who had just endured months of brutal fighting, disease, and the destruction wrought upon their own territory certainly had grievances enough to justify, in the logic of the age, summary execution. That this did not happen owed a great deal to the practical calculations of Turantia's commanders, who recognized that a living king of France was worth vastly more as a bargaining chip and a source of ransom than a dead one, and to certain conventions of chivalric and diplomatic conduct that, however inconsistently observed, still carried weight even across the religious divide separating Crusader and Ayyubid worlds. Louis was held, along with his surviving commanders and a substantial number of captured knights and soldiers, in the town of Mansoura itself, in conditions that Joinville, who was among those captured and held alongside other surviving nobles, describes as harsh but not without a degree of formal courtesy extended toward the highest-ranking prisoners. Negotiations began almost immediately over the terms of Louis's release, negotiations complicated by the ongoing and precarious military situation, since Damietta itself, still held by a Crusader garrison and by Queen Margaret, Louis's wife, who had remained in the city throughout the campaign, and was, at the time of the disaster at Farasker, only days away from giving birth to their son, remained a crucial bargaining asset that Turantia wanted returned to Egyptian control as part of any settlement. Queen Margaret's conduct during this period deserves particular attention because it is one of the more remarkable and underappreciated episodes of courage in the entire Crusade. Learning of her husband's capture and the destruction of the army while she herself was on the verge of childbirth in Damietta, a city now vulnerable to panic, desertion by the mercenary garrison, and potential Egyptian assault, Margaret gave birth to a son, whom she named Jean Tristan, a name reflecting the sorrow of the circumstances, and then, according to Joinville's account, immediately turned her attention to holding the city together. She is said to have summoned the Italian merchants and mercenaries, whose ships and soldiers formed the core of Damietta's defense and garrison, and upon learning that many intended to abandon the city out of fear once news of the king's capture spread, she reportedly negotiated directly with them, even offering to personally guarantee, from her own resources, payment for provisions and wages to keep them from deserting their posts. A display of resolve and leadership under almost unimaginable personal and physical strain that historians have long recognized as essential to preserving any negotiating leverage at all during the ransom talks. The negotiations for Louis's release, and for the release of the thousands of other Crusader captives held throughout Egypt, proceeded over the following weeks against the backdrop of political drama and violence, on the Egyptian side, that would prove just as consequential for the future of the region as anything the Crusaders themselves had done. Chapter 11: The Fall of Turantia and the Rise of the Mamluks. Turantia, the new sultan whose arrival from Syria had turned the tide of the campaign against the Crusaders, proved to be a poor judge of the delicate political balance he had inherited. His father's success, and indeed the successful defense of Egypt against Louis's invasion, had depended heavily on the loyalty, competence, and cooperation of the Mamluk regiments, particularly the elite corps known as the Bariya, soldiers who had been personally purchased, trained, and promoted by the late Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, and who considered themselves the old sultan's personal creation and legacy. Bound to his memory, by ties of loyalty that did not automatically transfer to his son. Rather than working to secure the loyalty of these powerful and battle-tested commanders, several contemporary accounts describe Turancha as behaving in ways that alienated them, favoring his own retinue of followers brought from Syria over the established Mamluk hierarchy, and reportedly making threatening or dismissive remarks about reducing the influence and rewards of the very soldiers who had just secured his throne and defeated the Crusader invasion. Whether driven by genuine political miscalculation, simple arrogance, or a justified but badly mishandled attempt to assert his own authority over an entrenched military faction, Turancha's behavior in the weeks immediately following his victory over Louis proved fatally short-sighted. In early May of 1250, only days after finalizing key elements of the negotiations over Louis's ransom, a group of Mamluk commanders, including the same Baybars who had distinguished himself in the fighting at Mansura, moved against Turancha directly. The new sultan was attacked, reportedly while at a banquet, wounded, and fled to a wooden tower near the Nile, which the conspirators then set on fire to force him out. When he emerged and attempted to escape by wading into the river itself, he was pursued and killed by Baybars' own hand, according to several chronicle traditions, in the water of the Nile, bringing an abrupt and violent end to the Ayyubid dynasty's direct control over Egypt, barely more than 2 months after that same dynasty's forces had achieved one of the most complete military victories against a European crusade in the entire history of the crusading movement. This assassination placed Louis, still a captive and still in the midst of finalizing the terms of his own ransom, in an extraordinarily precarious position. The negotiations he had been conducting were with a regime that had just been violently overthrown, and for a tense period, the fate of the captive king hung in genuine uncertainty as the new Mamluk power structure, with Shajar al-Dur elevated to the remarkable position of sultana, ruling in her own name. A nearly unprecedented arrangement in the Islamic world worked out how it wished to proceed. Joinville describes genuine fear among the captives during this period that the change in regime might lead to their mass execution, a fear grounded in the very real chaos and violence of the transition. And by some accounts, Louis and his fellow prisoners were subjected to a moment of genuine terror when armed men, swords drawn, entered the area where they were held, an episode that several sources suggest may have been intended as a threat or test rather than an actual attempt at execution, but which left a permanent impression on those who lived through it. In the end, practical considerations prevailed. The new Mamluk leadership, whatever their internal turmoil, still recognized the immense value of ransoming a king of France and his surviving nobility, both for the money involved and for the diplomatic and territorial concessions that could be extracted as part of the settlement. The negotiations, resumed and finalized under the new regime, produced an agreement in early May of 1250. Louis would be released in exchange for the return of Damietta to Egyptian control and the payment of a very substantial ransom, reported by Joinville and other sources at 800,000 gold bezants, an enormous sum by any medieval standard, roughly equivalent, by some estimates, to half of the annual revenue of the entire Kingdom of France, to be paid partly before Louis's own release and partly after, with a portion of the Crusader nobility remaining as hostages for the balance. Chapter 12. Ransom, Release, and a King's Difficult Choice. Louis was released from captivity in early May of 1250, following the surrender of Damietta back to Egyptian forces and the payment of the first installment of his ransom, a scene that Joinville describes with a mixture of relief and lingering bitterness, since the terms extracted from the defeated Crusaders were, inevitably, humiliating, a stark reversal from the triumphant landing that had begun the Egyptian campaign less than a year earlier. Contemporary accounts describe a moment during the final negotiations when Egyptian officials, in the process of counting out the ransom payment, found the sum coming up short by a considerable margin, and Louis, informed of the shortfall, reportedly instructed his own treasurer to make up the difference immediately and without argument. A small but telling detail that chroniclers preserved as evidence of the king's personal integrity and his determination not to let technical disputes over money delay the freedom of his men, even at his own kingdom's further expense. With his own freedom secured, Louis faced an urgent and consequential decision: whether to return immediately to France, where his mother Blanche of Castile had been governing as regent for nearly 2 years amid growing unrest, and where his own presence was, by any conventional political logic, badly needed, or whether to remain in the Holy Land to continue supporting the beleaguered Crusader states, and to work toward the release of the many Crusaders still held captive in Egypt, since the ransom agreement had covered Louis's own release and that of the highest-ranking nobles. But thousands of common soldiers and lower-ranking knights remained enslaved or imprisoned across Egypt, their fates far less certain. Louis chose to stay. This decision surprised and, in some cases, frustrated his own advisors and vassals, many of whom, having endured the catastrophe of the campaign, the loss of friends and kinsmen, and months of captivity or hardship, were desperate to return home. Louis, however, felt a profound sense of religious and moral obligation to the remaining captives and to the fragile Crusader states of the Levant, which, even after the disaster in Egypt, still needed reinforcement, fortification, and diplomatic support if they were to survive at all against the growing power of a newly assertive Mamluk Egypt. He sailed not for France but for Acre, the effective capital of what remained of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, arriving in May of 1250, and he would remain in the Holy Land for nearly 4 more years. An extended and, in its own way, remarkable second phase of the Crusade that receives far less popular attention than the dramatic rise and fall of the Egyptian campaign, but which reveals a great deal about Louis's character, his diplomatic skill, and the complicated, often quietly constructive legacy that a failed military crusade could still leave behind. It is to those years in Acre, and to the eventual return to France that finally closed this long chapter of Louis's life, that we turn next. Chapter 13, Fortifying the Holy Land. When Louis arrived in Acre in May of 1250, he found a Crusader kingdom that was, in almost every practical sense, a shadow of what it had been even at the start of the Seventh Crusade. The field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had already been effectively destroyed at La Fourby in 1244, before Louis had even left France, and now the disaster in Egypt had consumed a large part of the reinforcements that might otherwise have shored up the kingdom's defenses. What remained were a handful of fortified coastal cities, Acre chief among them, along with Tyre, Sidon, Jaffa, and Caesarea, each a fragile island of Christian control surrounded by hostile, or, at best, unpredictable territory, dependent almost entirely on sea power and fortification for survival, since there was no longer any realistic prospect of contesting the interior in open battle. Louis dedicated much of his remaining time in the Levant to precisely this work of fortification, using the substantial resources of the French crown, along with money that continued to arrive from Europe in response to his appeals, to rebuild and strengthen the walls and defenses of these coastal strongholds. He personally oversaw and funded significant construction work at Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon, and contributed to the defenses of Acre itself, work that modern archaeologists and historians studying the surviving fortifications of these sites have been able to trace directly to Louis's investment during this period. This was unglamorous, unheroic labor compared to the drama of the Egyptian campaign, but it was arguably some of the most consequential and lasting work Louis did during his entire time in the East, extending the practical survival of the Crusader states by years, even decades, beyond what their military and demographic weakness alone would have allowed. Louis also worked to redeem as many of the captives still held in Egypt as he could manage through continued diplomatic pressure and payment, an effort that took years and was never fully completed. Since thousands of common soldiers, lacking the ransom value of nobles and knights, remained enslaved or lost to history, a grim reminder that the human cost of the Crusade extended far beyond the noble names recorded in chronicles like Joinville's, into an anonymous mass of suffering that medieval sources rarely bothered to individually document. Throughout this period, Joinville remained close to the king, and his chronicle offers an intimate, often surprisingly personal portrait of Louis during these years. A king who fasted rigorously, who involved himself personally in matters of justice and charity, even while managing the complex politics of a fragile frontier kingdom, who debated theology and morality with Joinville in long conversations that Joinville later recorded with evident affection, and who continued to wrestle, visibly, with questions of conscience regarding the disaster in Egypt and what it meant for his own soul and his fitness to rule. Chapter 14. Diplomacy amid the ruins. Louis's years in Acre were not purely defensive or administrative. They were also marked by an active, if ultimately limited, diplomatic effort to exploit the divisions and shifting alliances of the wider Muslim and Mongol world in ways that might benefit the beleaguered Crusader states, even after the military catastrophe in Egypt had eliminated any prospect of achieving gains through force alone. One of the most significant diplomatic threads of this period involved renewed contact with the Mongols. The Mongol Empire, by the early 1250s, had continued its extraordinary westward expansion, and its armies and administrators were increasingly present and active in the regions bordering Christian and Muslim territories in the Near East. Louis, remembering the earlier and largely fruitless mission he had sent to the Mongol court before departing on crusade, dispatched a new embassy, most famously entrusting the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck with a mission to travel to the court of the great Khan himself, deep in Mongolia, a journey of such length, difficulty, and cultural significance that William's own written account of it remains one of the most valuable European travel narratives of the entire medieval period. Offering detailed and remarkably observant descriptions of Mongol society, religion, and court life that reached far beyond anything Louis or his advisors had likely anticipated when the mission was conceived. The hoped-for grand alliance between Christian Europe and the Mongol Empire against a common Muslim enemy did not materialize in any concrete military form during Louis's lifetime, but the diplomatic and intellectual contact established during this period laid groundwork for later, more substantial Mongol-Frankish cooperation, particularly in the following decades when Mongol forces under Hulagu would, for a time, actually cooperate militarily with the remaining Crusader states against the Mamluks, most notably in the lead-up to the pivotal Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, an event that occurred after Louis had already returned to France, but whose roots trace partly back to the diplomatic contacts he helped establish. Closer to home, Louis also navigated the complicated and fractious politics of the Ayyubid successor states in Syria, particularly Damascus, whose rulers were often in open conflict with the new Mamluk regime in Egypt that had overthrown Turanshah. Louis skillfully, if cautiously, exploited these divisions, at times negotiating truces or agreements with the Syrian Ayyubids that indirectly benefited the security of the Crusader coastal cities, playing regional rivals against each other in a manner that, while it could not undo the strategic damage of the Egyptian defeat, nonetheless bought valuable time and a measure of security for a kingdom that had precious little of either. Louis also maintained, throughout this period, a substantial and active correspondence with Europe, appealing for continued financial and military support, and closely monitoring the situation in France through the reports of his mother, Queen Blanche, who continued to govern the kingdom in his absence with the same firm hand she had displayed during his minority decades earlier. Chapter 15. The Death of a Regent and the Long Road Home. In November of 1252, word reached Louis in Acre of his mother's death. Blanche of Castile had governed France as regent for nearly 4 years during her son's absence, managing the kingdom's finances, suppressing occasional unrest, and maintaining the stability that allowed Louis the freedom to remain in the Holy Land, pursuing his diplomatic and defensive work rather than rushing home to attend to domestic crises. Her death removed the political arrangement that had made Louis's extended absence sustainable, and it left the governance of France in a far less certain position, since no other figure commanded the same combination of authority, experience, and unquestioned loyalty to the Capetian dynasty that Blanche had provided across 2 separate regencies, spanning much of Louis's life. The news of his mother's passing affected Louis deeply, by all accounts, compounding what had already been years of physical hardship, personal loss, from his brother Robert's death at Mansoura to the deaths of countless companions and soldiers throughout the campaign, and the lingering psychological weight of presiding over one of the great military disasters in the history of the crusading movement. And yet even this loss did not immediately send him home. Louis remained in Acre for approximately another year and a half, continuing his work of fortification and diplomacy, apparently determined to leave the Crusader states in as strong and stable a position as circumstances allowed before finally departing. It was not until April of 1254 that Louis finally set sail from Acre, bringing to a close nearly 6 years since he had first departed France, 6 years that had encompassed triumph at Damietta, catastrophe at Mansoura and Farisker, personal captivity, and a long, patient, largely unheralded second act of fortification and diplomacy in the Levant. The return voyage itself was not without incident. His ship reportedly ran aground and nearly sank near Cyprus, an alarming episode that Joinville records in some detail, describing the king's calm demeanor and continued piety even as sailors and passengers feared for their lives. A final small vignette that captures the persistent image, cultivated across Joinville's entire chronicle, of Louis as a man whose faith remained steady even amid repeated brushes with disaster. Louis finally arrived back in France in July of 1254, landing near Hyères on the southern coast, and made his way back toward Paris, greeted, by most accounts, with genuine relief and celebration by a populace and nobility that had, for years, wondered whether their king would ever return at all, and who had absorbed the shock of the Egyptian disaster with a mixture of grief, disbelief, and a quiet, growing reverence for a monarch whose personal courage and piety seemed, if anything, to have been enhanced rather than diminished by the scale of the catastrophe he had endured and survived. Chapter 16: The Long Shadow of a Failed Crusade. What in the end did the Seventh Crusade accomplish? Militarily, judged by its own stated objectives, it was an unambiguous failure. Egypt was not conquered. Jerusalem was not recovered. The crusading army that Louis had spent years and a staggering fortune assembling was largely destroyed, its finest knights killed in the streets of Mansoura or lost to disease and starvation in the retreat that followed, and the King of France himself had suffered the singular indignity of capture, an outcome without close precedent among crusading monarchs of his stature. The human cost was immense and largely unrecorded in its full extent. Thousands of common soldiers dead, enslaved, or simply lost to history, their fates unknown even to the chroniclers who meticulously recorded the deaths of noble knights by name. And yet the consequences of the crusade rippled outward in ways that neither Louis nor his contemporaries could have fully anticipated at the time. The political chaos triggered in Egypt by the crusade, the concealment of al-Salih Ayyub's death, the assassination of Turanshah, and the resulting rise of Mamluk military leaders to direct political power, culminating in the establishment of the Mamluk Sultanate, arguably accelerated a transformation of Egyptian and eventually regional politics that would produce, within just a decade, a far more formidable and centralized Muslim military power than the fractured late Ayyubid confederation Louis had originally invaded. It was this new Mamluk state, under leaders including the same Baybars who had fought at Mansura and helped kill Turanshah, that would go on to halt the Mongol advance at Ain Jalut in 1260, and, over subsequent decades, systematically dismantle what remained of the Crusader states, capturing Acre itself in 1291 in an assault that finally extinguished nearly 2 centuries of Latin Christian presence in the Holy Land. For Louis personally, the Crusade had a complicated and paradoxical legacy. Rather than diminishing his prestige and authority, as one might expect following such a catastrophic military failure, the Crusade appears to have enhanced his moral and religious standing, both among his own subjects and across Christian Europe more broadly. His personal courage in battle, his refusal to abandon his men during the retreat even at the cost of his own freedom, his integrity in the ransom negotiations, and his years of patient, unglamorous work fortifying and defending the Crusader states after his release all combined to build an image of Louis not as a failed commander, but as an exemplary Christian king whose personal virtue transcended the practical outcome of his campaigns. This reputation would only grow across the remainder of his reign, through his later work as a lawgiver and reformer of French justice, his role as an internationally respected arbiter of disputes between other Christian rulers, and his continued, almost compulsive personal piety, all of which culminated in his canonization as a saint by the Catholic Church in 1297, just 27 years after his death. An unusually rapid canonization that reflected the depth and speed with which his reputation for holiness had spread. Louis's story with the crusading movement, remarkably, did not end with his return to France in 1254. 17 years later, in 1270, despite his advancing age and the well-documented catastrophe of his first expedition, Louis would take the cross once again and lead what became known as the Eighth Crusade, this time directed at Tunis in North Africa rather than Egypt, a campaign that would prove even shorter, and in its own way, even more tragic than the Seventh, as Louis himself would fall ill and die outside the walls of Tunis before any significant military engagement could take place, bringing his life and his lifelong crusading commitment to an end within sight of yet another foreign shore. The Seventh Crusade, then, stands in history as something more complex than a simple military failure. It was a demonstration of the extraordinary logistical and financial capacity of a consolidating medieval monarchy, a case study in how personal piety and political calculation intertwined in the mind of a medieval king, a pivotal, if unintended, catalyst in the political transformation of Egypt from Ayyubid to Mamluk rule, and in the person of Louis IX, the origin point of a reputation for sanctity that would outlive by centuries the memory of the specific battles and betrayals that filled its story. It is a story of a king who nearly died before it began, who found the height of both his glory and his humiliation in the mud of the Nile Delta, and whose failure, paradoxically, helped make him a saint. Chapter 17, The World That Sent Them. To fully understand the Seventh Crusade, we need to step back from the battlefield and look at the society that produced it, because the Crusade was not simply the personal project of one devout king. It was the product of an entire civilization organized, at every level, around ideas of holy war, penance, and the belief that armed pilgrimage to the East was one of the highest expressions of Christian devotion available to a layperson, particularly a layperson of noble or royal rank. By the middle of the 13th century, crusading had developed its own elaborate legal, financial, and spiritual infrastructure within Latin Christendom. Taking the cross was a formal legal act, recorded and recognized by the Church, that conferred specific privileges and protections on the crusader. A moratorium on debts owed to Christian creditors, protection of family property from seizure during the Crusaders' absence, exemption from certain taxes, and most importantly from a spiritual standpoint, a plenary indulgence, a full remission of the temporal punishment due for sin, granted by the Pope to anyone who completed the vow of crusading, whether by reaching the Holy Land, dying en route, or in later refinements of the system, simply paying an equivalent sum of money to fund someone else's participation. This last innovation, allowing crusading vows to be commuted into cash payments, had become an important source of crusading finance by Louis's time, even as it drew criticism from some quarters for seeming to reduce a supposedly spiritual sacrifice to a mere financial transaction. The society that produced Louis's Crusaders was also one saturated with the memory and mythology of earlier crusades, transmitted through chansons de geste, epic poems and songs performed at courts and in marketplaces, celebrating the deeds of earlier crusading heroes, real and legendary, from the Knights of the First Crusade to the more recent memory of Richard the Lionheart. Young noblemen grew up hearing these stories, absorbing an ideal of chivalric identity in which crusading service represented the ultimate proving ground for knightly virtue, a stage on which a nobleman could demonstrate courage, piety, and honor simultaneously, earning renown in this world and salvation in the next. At the same time, by the 1240s, there were already voices of skepticism and criticism regarding the crusading enterprise, particularly following the diversion and sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, and the repeated failures to achieve lasting results in the Holy Land, despite enormous expenditures of money and lives across nearly a century and a half of continuous effort. Some churchmen and intellectuals had begun to question whether the crusading model itself was flawed, whether resources might be better spent on missionary efforts to convert rather than military campaigns to conquer, or whether the papacy's increasing tendency to declare crusades against its own political enemies within Europe, including the ongoing crusade-like conflict against Emperor Frederick II that consumed so much of Pope Innocent IV's attention during exactly the years Louis was preparing his own expedition, had begun to dilute and corrupt the entire concept of holy war. Louis himself seems to have been largely insulated from, or simply uninterested in, these currents of doubt. His own crusading conviction remained remarkably undimmed by either the criticism of contemporaries or, eventually, by the catastrophic personal experience of failure and captivity that might have broken a less resolutely pious man's faith in the entire undertaking. Chapter 18: Arms, Armor, and the Anatomy of a Crusading Army. What did Louis's army actually look like, and how did it fight? Understanding the physical and tactical realities of a 13th century crusading force helps explain both the successes and the catastrophic failures of the campaign. At the core of the army stood the mounted knight, the heavily armored nobleman whose training from childhood centered on mounted combat with lance and sword, and whose social identity was inseparable from his military function. By Louis's time, knights typically wore mail armor, an interlocking mesh of iron rings that provided flexible but substantial protection against slashing blows, and to a lesser degree, against thrusts and missile fire, often reinforced with additional plates protecting particularly vulnerable areas. A great helm, cylindrical and heavy, offered facial protection but famously restricted vision and breathing, a serious tactical liability in the confused, close-quarters fighting that characterized the disaster inside Mansoura. Knights rode destriers, specially bred and trained warhorses valued enormously both for their combat utility and simply as a measure of a knight's wealth and status, animals whose loss, through death, injury, or, as happened catastrophically during the retreat from Mansoura, starvation, could reduce even the finest knight to relative helplessness on foot. Below the knightly class, sergeants, mounted and unmounted soldiers of lesser social rank, formed a crucial part of the army's fighting strength, often more numerous than the knights themselves, and equipped with somewhat lighter armor and weapons but still professionally trained for combat. Crossbowmen represented one of the most tactically significant elements of a crusading army of this period. The crossbow, capable of penetrating mail armor at moderate range and requiring far less lifelong training to use effectively than a longbow, had become a mainstay of European armies, and Louis's crusade included substantial contingents of crossbowmen, including specialized Genoese mercenary crossbow units renowned across Europe for their skill. The army also depended on a vast supporting infrastructure rarely depicted in popular imagination of crusading warfare. Engineers responsible for siege equipment, and, in the case of the Mansura campaign, the ill-fated causeway across the canal, blacksmiths and armorers maintaining and repairing weapons and armor. Physicians and surgeons, of limited but genuine medical knowledge by medieval standards, who nonetheless proved tragically inadequate against the scale of disease that ultimately devastated the army. Chaplains and clergy providing the spiritual support considered essential to an enterprise understood, at its core, as a religious undertaking rather than a purely military one. And an enormous number of non-combatant servants, grooms, cooks, and laborers, whose numbers likely equaled or exceeded the fighting men themselves, and whose needs for food, water, and shelter placed enormous strain on the army's logistics, particularly once the supply lines back to Damietta were severed during the fatal encirclement near Mansura. On the Egyptian and Mamluk side, the Crusaders faced an opponent whose military system, while sharing some technological similarities, particularly in the use of mail armor and crossbows, differed fundamentally in its emphasis on mounted archery, a skill requiring years of dedicated training that the Mamluk system cultivated deliberately and systematically among its slave soldiers from a young age, producing horsemen capable of firing composite bows with devastating accuracy while at full gallop, a tactical capability that European heavy cavalry, built around the shock impact of a mounted charge with lance, struggled to counter effectively in open terrain, though the Crusaders' own close-order discipline and heavier armor gave them real advantages in direct, close-quarters engagement, as demonstrated by their success in the pitched battle following the crossing of the ford, even as their inability to catch or evade the more mobile Mamluk horse archers ultimately contributed to the strategic strangulation of their position. Chapter 19. The Mamluk System. The institution of Mamluk slave soldiery, so central to the outcome of the Seventh Crusade, deserves closer examination, both because of its decisive role at Mansura and because of the extraordinary historical trajectory it set in motion, one that would shape the Middle East for the following 2.5 centuries. Mamluk, an Arabic word meaning, roughly, one who is owned, referred specifically to military slaves, typically boys purchased in youth from regions north and east of the Islamic heartlands, particularly from Turkic-speaking Central Asia and the Caucasus, though later periods would draw increasingly on the Caucasus alone. These boys were not slaves in the sense familiar from other historical contexts of agricultural or domestic bondage. Rather, they were purchased specifically to be raised, trained, and eventually often freed into a distinct military and political elite, converted to Islam, educated in the Arabic and Turkic languages, and drilled intensively for years in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and the broader military and courtly culture of the regime they served. Upon completing this training, a Mamluk was typically manumitted, formally freed, and enrolled as a professional soldier in a regiment tied by bonds of personal loyalty to the individual ruler, in this case Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, who had purchased and raised him. This system produced soldiers of exceptional skill and loyalty, at least to the individual patron who had raised them, but it also created an inherent structural tension whenever succession passed from that patron to an heir, precisely the tension that destroyed Turanshah within weeks of his arrival in Egypt. The Bariya regiment in particular, so named because their barracks had been located on an island in the Nile, the word bar meaning river or sea in Arabic, had been al-Salih Ayyub's personal creation and pride, and their loyalty to his memory, combined with Turanshah's clumsy handling of the transition, produced exactly the violent rupture that placed Baybars and his fellow conspirators on the path toward eventual supreme political power. The elevation of Shajar al-Durr to the Sultanate immediately following Turanshah's assassination, and the subsequent rapid consolidation of Mamluk political control over Egypt in the years following 1250, represented far more than a change of ruling personnel. It represented the emergence of an entirely new type of state, one in which political and military power resided not in a hereditary royal dynasty in the conventional sense, but in a self-perpetuating military caste that recruited its own replacements from outside the existing population generation after generation, a system with no close parallel in contemporary Christian Europe, and one that would prove, for a very long time, extraordinarily durable and militarily effective, defeating not only the crusading remnants along the Levanten coast in the following decades, but also, at Ain Jalut in 1260, halting what had seemed to be the unstoppable westward advance of the Mongol Empire itself, a victory achieved under the same Baybars who had killed Fakhr al-Din's routed forces, charged through the streets of Mansoura, and struck the fatal blow against Turanshah in the Nile. Chapter 20. Voices from the Other Side. Most popular accounts of the Seventh Crusade, understandably given the extraordinary richness of Joinville's chronicle, are told overwhelmingly from the Crusader perspective. But the Muslim world produced its own rich historical tradition documenting these same events, and incorporating those sources gives us a fuller, more balanced picture of the campaign. The Ayyubid-era historian Ibn Wasil, who lived through these events and had direct access to the Ayyubid court and its officials, provides one of the most detailed contemporary Arabic accounts of the Crusade, describing the landing at Damietta, the death of al-Salih Ayyub and its concealment, and the fighting at Mansoura from the Egyptian perspective, corroborating many details found in Joinville while adding crucial context about internal Egyptian politics that the French chronicler, naturally, had no access to or interest in recording. Later historians writing in the Mamluk period itself, including the prolific 15th century Egyptian historian al-Makhrizi, drew on earlier sources, some now lost, to compile detailed narrative histories of the Ayyubid to Mamluk transition, treating the defeat of Louis's crusade and the subsequent political revolution it triggered as a foundational episode in the origin story of the Mamluk Sultanate itself, a state that would rule Egypt and Syria until the Ottoman conquest in 1517. From this perspective, the Seventh Crusade appears not primarily as a story about a French king's piety and misfortune, but as the improbable catalyst for one of the most significant political transformations in medieval Middle Eastern history, the birth of a slave soldier state that would go on to save the Islamic world from Mongol conquest and extinguish, once and for all, the Crusader presence on the Levanten coast. Arabic chronicle sources also preserve details about the treatment of Crusader captives, the administration of the ransom negotiations, and the internal debates within the Egyptian and Mamluk leadership about how to handle the captured king, that add considerable nuance to the picture derived from Joinville alone, including indications that opinion among the Mamluk commanders was genuinely divided over whether Louis should be ransomed, executed, or held indefinitely. A reminder that the survival of a king of France in 1250 was not simply a foregone conclusion dictated by chivalric convention, but the outcome of a real, and for a time, uncertain political calculation on the part of his captors. Reading these sources alongside Joinville reveals a conflict experienced very differently by its two sides. For the Crusaders, a righteous, if ultimately doomed, act of religious devotion. For the Egyptians and Mamluks, an existential threat to their homeland that, once repelled, became bound up inextricably with a political revolution already brewing within their own ruling institutions, a revolution the Crusade did not create from nothing, but almost certainly accelerated and intensified. Chapter 21. Shajar al-Durr, the Sultana. Among all the figures who shaped the outcome of the Seventh Crusade, few are as remarkable or as historically underappreciated in Western popular memory as Shajar al-Durr. Her origins remain somewhat obscure, as was common for figures who entered elite households as slaves, but she rose from that status to become a wife of Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, and evidently, a woman of exceptional intelligence, political acumen, and personal resolve. Qualities that would prove decisive at the most critical juncture of the entire crusade. It was Shajar al-Durr who orchestrated the concealment of her husband's death at the very moment the Crusader army was preparing its advance toward Mansoura, an act of political theater sustained over weeks that required coordinating the silence and cooperation of a substantial circle of officials, guards, and household staff, any one of whom could have exposed the deception and potentially triggered exactly the succession crisis the concealment was designed to prevent. That she succeeded in this deception, buying the time necessary for Turancha to travel from Syria and formally assume command, stands as one of the more extraordinary and consequential acts of political management in the history of the Crusades, arguably as important to the ultimate Egyptian victory as any single battlefield decision. Following Turancha's assassination in May of 1250, in the immediate aftermath of finalizing Louis's ransom, Shajar al-Durr was elevated to the position of Sultana, reigning in her own name and issuing coinage and official documents under her own royal title, an arrangement almost unprecedented in the history of Islamic states up to that time, and one that provoked considerable controversy, including reported disapproval from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the nominal spiritual and political head of the wider Sunni Muslim world, regarding the propriety of a woman ruling as sultan in her own right. Political pressure, both internal and external, eventually led to an arrangement in which Shajar al-Durr married a senior Mamluk commander, Aybak, who assumed the formal title of sultan, while she continued to exercise very substantial influence behind the scenes, a compromise that preserved much of her practical power while satisfying, at least nominally, contemporary expectations about the gender of a ruling sultan. Shajar al-Durr's story would ultimately end in violence. Years after the events of the Seventh Crusade, amid continuing court intrigue, she was implicated in the killing of her own husband Aybak and was herself killed shortly afterward in a palace conflict, a dramatic and tragic end to the career of a woman who had, at the campaign's most critical hour, done more than perhaps any single individual to determine the outcome of Louis's invasion of Egypt. Her story is a powerful reminder that the history of the Crusades, so often narrated as a contest between kings and knights, was shaped at its most decisive moments by figures, including women operating within and against the constraints of deeply patriarchal societies, whose contributions have often been minimized or forgotten in the traditional Western telling of these events. Chapter 22. The Military Orders at Mansoura. The Knights Templar, and to a somewhat lesser extent in this particular campaign, the Knights Hospitaller, deserve dedicated attention in any full accounting of the Seventh Crusade, both because of the catastrophic losses they suffered in the charge into Mansoura, and because of the distinctive institutional role the military orders played within crusading armies more broadly. By the 1240s, the Templars and Hospitallers had existed for well over a century as permanent, professional military religious orders, combining the vows of monastic life, poverty, chastity, and obedience, with a dedicated mission of armed defense of the Holy Land and its Christian pilgrims. Unlike the feudal contingents that made up the bulk of Louis's army, tied to specific secular lords and returning home once their term of service or the campaign itself concluded, the military orders maintained a permanent, standing military presence in the Levant, with their own fortresses, revenues drawn from extensive landholdings across Europe, and experienced commanders who had often spent decades fighting in the specific conditions of Near Eastern warfare, giving them a depth of local knowledge and combat experience that most crusaders arriving fresh from Europe simply could not match. This experience is precisely why the Templar commanders present at the ford crossing on the morning of the 8th of February, 1250, argued so strenuously against Robert of Artois' proposal to charge immediately into Mansura without waiting for the main army to cross and consolidate. Their objections were not born of cowardice, whatever accusations Robert leveled at them in the heat of the moment, but of hard-won tactical wisdom about the dangers of committing an unsupported vanguard into unfamiliar, confined urban terrain against an enemy whose numbers and disposition remained uncertain. That this wisdom was overridden by the impulsive insistence of a prince whose royal blood gave him effective command authority over even the most experienced military professionals in the army, illustrates one of the recurring structural problems of crusading warfare throughout its history: the frequent subordination of professional military judgment to the personal authority and honor-driven decision-making of highborn commanders, whose combat experience often paled in comparison to that of the specialists nominally under their command. The result was catastrophic for the Templar Order specifically. Chronicle accounts suggest that a very substantial proportion of the Templar Knights present in Egypt, quite possibly the majority of their entire fighting contingent committed to the Crusade, were killed in the fighting inside Mansura, a loss that took years to rebuild, and that weakened the Order's military capacity in the Levant at a moment when that capacity was needed more urgently than ever, given the deteriorating strategic position of the Crusader states following the disaster. The Hospitallers, while present and active throughout the campaign, appear to have suffered somewhat less catastrophically in this specific engagement, though they too bore significant losses across the broader campaign, including the earlier battle and the disease-ridden retreat. The destruction of so much of the Templar and Hospitaller military leadership and manpower at Mansura stands as one of the clearest illustrations of how a single moment of poor command judgment, however understandable in the psychology of medieval chivalric culture with its intense emphasis on personal honor and glory, could inflict damage on the crusading enterprise that rippled forward for years, well beyond the immediate battlefield consequences of that single reckless charge. Chapter 23: The Common Soldier's War. History remembers the Seventh Crusade largely through the names of kings, princes, and chroniclers of noble birth, but the overwhelming majority of the men who sailed with Louis, fought at Damietta and Mansura, and died in the retreat or vanished into Egyptian captivity, were common soldiers, sergeants, servants, and laborers whose individual names and stories were rarely recorded by the chroniclers of their own age. It is worth pausing to consider the Crusade from their vantage point, insofar as the surviving sources allow. For an ordinary foot soldier or sergeant, the decision to join a crusade often carried a very different set of motivations than it did for a king moved by a fever vow or a great lord bound by feudal obligation and dynastic reputation. Some joined out of genuine religious conviction, drawn by the promise of the plenary indulgence, and the chance to participate personally in what their entire culture told them was among the holiest acts a Christian could undertake. Others joined for far more practical reasons. The wages, however modest, offered by lords recruiting soldiers for the campaign, the prospect of plunder, the chance to escape debts or legal troubles at home through the Crusaders' legal protections, or simply the pull of loyalty and community when a lord or parish organized a local contingent and social pressure, made staying behind feel like a kind of quiet dishonor. Life for these men during the campaign was almost unimaginably hard by modern standards, and harder still than the hardships endured by the mounted nobility, who at least traveled on horseback, wore superior armor, and received priority in the allocation of food and medical attention when supplies grew scarce. Common soldiers marched on foot through desert and marsh, slept in the open or in crowded, insect-infested tents, and depended on a supply system that, however impressively organized by medieval standards, was never able to keep pace with the needs of an army of this size operating so far from home for so long. When the disease that struck the camp near Mansura began to spread, it spread first and most devastatingly among these common ranks, whose diet was poorer, whose living conditions were more crowded, and whose access to whatever limited medical care the army could provide was far more restricted than that available to the nobility. When the final catastrophe came at Farisker, it was overwhelmingly common soldiers who bore the brunt of the slaughter and the enslavement that followed. While Louis and his highest-ranking nobles were held for ransom under conditions that, however harsh, still afforded them a recognized status and eventual release, thousands of ordinary crusaders faced a far bleaker fate: death in the immediate aftermath of capture, for those judged to have no ransom value, or a lifetime of slavery within the Egyptian and broader Islamic Mediterranean world for those who survived, a fate from which very few would ever return to Europe. Joinville's chronicle, for all its extraordinary detail, records comparatively little about the specific individual fates of these men, a silence that speaks less to their unimportance and more to the simple reality that medieval chroniclers, writing for and about a noble audience, rarely thought to record the names, families, or final fates of soldiers who lacked land, title, or lineage worth commemorating. Modern historians, piecing together fragmentary references across both European and Arabic sources, have worked to recover something of this hidden history, and W.H.